Okay, so we're in the process of going through protozoa, and we were talking about the different phyla that they belong to. And we had, going kind of backwards, we had sporozoa, we had the ciliates, they had a little cilia on the outside. We had the paramecium, was an example of a ciliate. We had sarcodines, they were the ones that are like amoeba that can change their shape. So we've talked about a number of different phyla, and this is going to be the last phyla of the protozoans. And the one this one's called Zoomastagina. We often refer to those as zooflagellates. Now, the zo in front of zoology means what? The study of animals, right? Like you have, the zoo has animals, okay? So these were thought of as being little animals, but they have flagella. So that's the thing that makes their means of moving around was by means of flagella. We have some that moved around because they could change their shape. We talked about some that had cilia. Now we're talking about some that have flagella. As far as their reproduction, they're kind of like a lot of the other protozoans. They carry on binary fission, which means they multiplied their genetic material and then they just divided in half. And you'd have two of them where you had one before. Okay? There are some examples in this phylum of some organisms that are capable of something that resembles sexual reproduction, where we have a genetic material being exchanged. Now, what are some examples of organisms that are in this? The first one is the Trochonympha. The Trochonympha is the organism that lives inside of termites. Termites eat wood, right? You know, like somebody's house or something like that. When we lived in Phoenix, the saying there was, either your house has termites or will have termites. In other words, it's like every house is going to have termites eventually. And so everybody's house needs to be treated to make sure that you don't get termites. But termites eat wood, but actually termites don't have any way of digesting cellulose. So they'd starve to death if they didn't have any way of digesting cellulose. The Trochonympha lives in its digestive tract and is capable of digesting cellulose. And then these digested materials it can benefit from, but so can the termite. So the termite is benefiting by having the Trochonympha live in its digestive tract. Now, the Trochonympha benefits by what? Living inside an organism that can chew up cellulose and bring it to it for it to digest. So it doesn't even have to go out and feed itself, you know. So the termite feeds the Trochonympha feeds the termite. So they both benefit from this relationship, okay? So that's what the Trochonympha looks like. Who did Africans? Did anybody do African sleeping sickness in this class? Laura did, okay. The African sleeping sickness, the organism that caused that is the trypanosoma. And these little purple things that look like, you know, like they're twisted and stuff like that, those are the organism that cause African sleeping sickness. But it's a kind of I guess I could have killed it on my phone, or on my watch. Now, let's talk about African sleeping sickness. You know, there's a lot of, diseases that we could have put in here, but this is one that we'll talk about. This one is carried by the tsetse fly. Notice it's T-S-E-T-S-E, tsetse. I try to pronounce the T and the S at the same time. And it will bite you, and in the process of biting you, it will put that organism into your body. Get right away into the bloodstream, where other organisms that get into your body that same way would be like malaria. When a mosquito bites you, the mosquito, when it puts this little proboscis into you to bite you or to sting you, however you want to think it actually injects some of its saliva into your body. Some of its saliva into your body. In the saliva are chemicals or proteins that keep your blood from clotting. Because if you poke into the mosquito pokes into your body senses it that there's a damage to certain part of my body, and so it will immediately try to close up the wound by clotting the blood. Well, if the blood were to clot, that mosquito is going to suck its brains out before it's going to get any blood out of you, because it would plug up his little straw, and so the saliva has this anticoagulant in it to keep the blood from clotting, so he can suck all the blood he wants to, and then he takes off, or you swat him before that. Okay. Now, what are some of the symptoms of African sleeping sickness? Brain inflammation. In other words, it's going to affect the brain. It's going to become inflamed. The blood vessels are going to become extended with a lot of blood. And as this progresses, it's going to affect how you think. You're going to have mental lethargy. In other words, you're going to have a hard time processing things and things like this as it is affecting the brain. And it, eventually, the reason why it's called African sleeping sickness is because eventually the people who have it are very drowsy. They fall asleep easily, stay asleep for long periods of time, and if not treated, it can lead to death. So, but it's caused by an organism that's in the phylum Zomastogena. Okay, so that finishes up what we were talking about, the different phyla and the way that these organisms can move around. Now let's talk about algae. And let's talk about some characteristics of algae. One is that algae can be either single cells that just kind of float around in the water, or they can be colonial. So like these, some people would call these seaweeds, but they look like plants, but they're actually colonies of algae. And they benefit by being together like this. Okay? But they don't have true tissue, so they're not real plants, because if it was a plant, it would have true tissue, where you have a group of cells performing the same function. But here, every cell has to perform all the functions of life. So it's not dividing the job up among different cells. It's every cell has to do its own. They just happen to live together. So sometimes we refer to this stuff in the ocean, which feeds a lot of animals. We talk about that as the grass of many waters. Another name it goes by is the staff of life. In other words, it's kind of like the important part of the food chain for things living in the ocean. There's animals that will eat this, which in turn will be eaten by other animals, and bigger animals typically. Now, since they are algae, they do produce their own food. So they carry on photosynthesis. Now, plankton are little tiny aquatic organisms living in the water. And these organisms actually are very important in feeding many animals that live in the ocean. There's actually some whales that have filter systems in their mouth. They'll filter out these little tiny organisms in the water and swallow it. But they're, they're kind of, we call them like filter feeders, filter out stuff out of the water. But zooplankton are little animals or protozoan that we find in large quantities in the ocean, and sometimes more in some areas than others. And whales quite often have figured out a way to, not found out a way, God gave them a way to filter this stuff out of the water to feed themselves. Okay? So we have phytoplankton. These are the ones that are capable of carrying on photosynthesis. They make their own food. These are consumed by the zooplankton and any other larger animals. Okay? So phytoplankton make their own food, and the zooplankton consume them. See the relationship there? So the phytoplankton are going to be your primary food producing organisms. They're kind of like at the bottom of the food chain. They don't live off of anything else. They make their own food. Everything kind of depends on them, kind of like plants. We here on land, we have cows that eat grass that make its own food, and then we eat cows. So we're higher up the food chain, I guess you'd say. Now it says these phytoplankton also perform about 70% of the oxygen, because that's one of the byproducts of photosynthesis, is not just food, but it's also making oxygen. So it says 70% of the oxygen producing of the world is actually produced by these organisms in the ocean. So our ocean has a lot of things in it for producing oxygen. So it's not just plants on land that produce oxygen. Actually, the majority of it actually happens in the ocean. Now, what can we use algae for? Okay, we can, from the algae, we can get things like potash, iodine. Iodine is important for your thyroid to function properly. And if you live in the center of a country far from the ocean and you don't eat seafood, your diet is usually pretty low in this, and that can cause thyroid diseases. When I was little, you'd often see women who apparently had a thyroid condition, and it gets swollen up great big. It looks like they have this big double chin, and then it's just the thyroid has swollen big, and they would remove that, and then you'd have to be on iodine treatment after that. But so often on these women that had it, you could tell that they'd had it because there was often a long scar that ran all the way along here like this. So now we make sure that everybody has enough iodine in their diet by putting iodine in what? Ever seen these containers that say iodized, and what's the next word after it? Salt, right. It's iodized salt. Now, we actually get way more iodine than we need, but, okay. Nitrogen is very important because plants need nitrogen to grow, so we can actually use the nitrogen we get from them to grow other plants, and obviously salt from them. They're also a good source of vitamins and minerals, and we can use them we can actually eat some of them, so we can eat them as a food crop, as such. They're also used in thickening up different foods. In other words, the food by itself would be probably real thin and runny, but by adding some of this to it, it makes it thicker. One of the names that it goes by that you might find inside of, if you looked at the ingredients on the label, it might have something called algin, A-L-G-I-N, and sometimes right after it in parentheses it'll say thickener. Okay, that's what they're using. They're using algae, ground up algae, to thicken whatever kind of food. So algin is what I said, is a name for algae that's used as a thickener in food. Sometimes like in ice cream and things like that. Boughten ice cream. Now, if you make your own ice cream, it doesn't have it in it. But if you'll notice that Boughten ice cream turns pretty liquidy right at first, but bought, you buy ice cream from the store, it tends to stay thicker, longer, even after it's starting to melt, because it has that thickener in it. Now, what are some structures that you're going to see when you study all the different kind of algae? You're going to have something called a thallus. This is going to be the basic unit of the algae. Okay, this is, in other words, if we talk about what's the building, like the basic unit that you can have, like you're the basic unit of humans, right? Well, the thallus is the basic unit of algae. The shape and size of these varies an awful lot from species to species. Another thing that you will often see is that algae the cells will be strung end to end like a filament, like a piece of thread. Some of them, they're unbranched, or just one single strand. Sometimes they branch out kind of like leaves on a pine tree or something like that, kind of branch out, kind of has that arrangement. But you can see different kind of branch shapes that they can be. Now, some of these algae have to be stuck to something. They aren't floating around in the water. So they have cells that perform that job of keeping the algae from floating away. And they're called holdfasts. And they anchor them to like something that's submerged. It could be something that's in the water, maybe like a rock, or maybe like a rotting tree, or something in the water they'll attach to so that when they aren't just carried away with the current. Now, these algae that have these are going to be sessile. Sessile means that they don't move away. They don't move around. They're stuck in one spot. So it's sort of like the opposite of being mobile, right? Mobile means you get to move around. Sessile means you're stuck in one spot. Why? Because you're attached to something. That doesn't mean they don't wave around in the water, but they're not moving from place to place. Now, some of them, you may have seen some of these if you've been to the ocean and you've seen the ocean waves wash some of this stuff up on the beach. You will. I remember when we were visiting in California, down by San Diego, saw a bunch of this washed up on the beach, and you see these little round things on it, but what those round things are is they're filled with gas. So when they're attached to the bottom, and these things that are filled with gas, instead of the organism just being laying on the bottom, they'll kind of float upright, and because they have no structure to make them stand up on their own, so without the water they just fall down. But in the water, these air-filled bladders will make them want to rise up. Now, if you cut them off on the bottom, they just float up to the surface. But they're attached at the bottom, and so they cause it to float, and then they expose more of the algae to the light so they can carry on more photosynthesis. So how do they reproduce? Okay, well, let's look at one of them. That's unicellular, and it makes a new algae organism by carrying on actually mitosis. The mitosis that we studied several chapters back carries on those steps. That has prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and then we have the resting phase, the interphase in between. They also reproduce themselves because this kind of naturally happens in the water as organisms bump into them, or if they're up close to the surface, let's say a boat goes through and the motor chops it up into tiny little pieces, or some animal living in the water goes swimming through it and knocks pieces of it off. You can break it into pieces, okay? And so this colony is broken up by some physical disturbance of some kind, and it'll just multiply itself and reform a colony. So now we'll have more than one colony before I had just one. Okay? Now some of them are capable of forming what we call zoospores. And these are algae that have flagella, and they can actually swim away and form a new colony. So even though I would say the adult form of algae for some of them can't move around because they have that hold fast, when they form these zoospores, they can then move off and somewhere else and form another structure, another algae structure. And now we have, so that's how it spreads. So these zoospores help it, but they have flagella, so that's their means of movement from one location to another. They do have sexual reproduction, but they don't have regular sperm and egg, because like the human sperm and the human egg look entirely different from each other. They're quite different. The egg is quite large, the sperm is actually quite small. The egg can't move around at all. The sperm has a flagella and can move around. Okay, now with this organism, they have gametes that we know are different, but they don't look different. You can't visibly tell this one is different than this one, but these will not combine with any of their own kind, let's say, nor will these. They need one, and so we just call some of them positive and some negative. Can't call them eggs and sperm, we just call one positive, one negative. There's a difference between the two, okay? And they will do the same thing as sperm and egg will do. They will fuse with each other and form a diploid zygote, okay? Same thing that humans do. We form a diploid zygote when we take a sperm and an egg. Okay? This is just not going to be a human. This is going to be another algae. Okay? And now, so we have zoospores. Now we have something called a zygospore. So a zoospore didn't involve sexual reproduction. It just produced another little organism that moves over here with flagella to a new location. When this happens, when we form a zygote, now we've created something with different genetic information than the parents, and so we have variety that happens this way. So these gametes, when they come together, form a diploid zygote, which we call a zygospore. So we had zygospore and then zoospores. The zygospore is surrounded by a hard protective covering. And when you put a hard protective covering around it, you know that for some reason needs for survival. So here's a parent cell, haploid, and it will form daughter cells by mitosis. But every cell is going to be exactly like the parent. These daughter cells will become, have flagella on them, and then we call those zoospores. Okay, so through mitosis, forming this, and they come zoospores, going someplace else, and then growing another organism from that. They also can, several of these, one can make a positive and one can make a negative, and they will join together and form a diploid zygote that will form a case around the outside, and then at one point they will break open and grow into another haploid parents, a new parent, the next generation parent cell. Okay, so that's kind of the life cycle of that particular algae. So it's capable of reproducing itself asexually by mitosis, and kind of like sexually by using plus and minus gametes. Not sperm and egg, but plus and minus gametes. Now, there's another kind of algae that's called the Spirogyra. And the reason why it's called Spirogyra is that when you look at this particular organism under the microscope, inside of the cell, you see chlorophyll in like a ribbon that actually spirals around on the inside of it. So that's the reason why we call it a Spirogyra. Okay? And remember we talked about conjugation once before, where two different organisms will grow a tube in between and share their genetic material. Okay? Spirogyra are capable of doing that same thing. So if there's two filaments, and the cell's in this filament and the cell in this filament, one will grow a tube in between, and a gamete from one cell. So this one formed a gamete, this one formed a gamete, and the gamete will go through the tube to the other one, and then after it's done that, it will form a zygote, and these zygotes then can form a zygospore, and these zygospores then can form zoospores that can move off and grow somewhere else. But see, here's these holdfast kind of what. So there's a filament stuck to something underwater that keep it from floating away. So now these gametes here are a little bit different. The other one they had pluses and minuses. These have gametes that are actually both the same. So we call those isogametes. We can't tell that one's different than the other. But they can combine with each other and form a zygote. So this one right here is the Eulithrex. It lives in fresh water. Their gametes are isogametes, not pluses and minuses. These are the same, so that's why we call it iso. Like as in geometry, you have two. It has two equal angles or two equal sides. We call it an isosceles triangle. Okay, we're using the iso the same way. It means equal. So the gametes are alike. And these cells, these isogametes, can swim around and fight each other and unite and form a zygote, or ultimately a zygospore. So they kind of do it in a slightly different way, but accomplish the same results. But is he awake or not? Okay, here's another one. Otogonia. Here, this one actually has different gametes. And how do we know they're different? Not just because of what will combine and what won't combine. They actually look different. Okay? They're different in size, structure, or both, you know. That's how we know that they're actually different. They have an oogonia. Now, when you put OO in the front, it means egg. That's something to do with egg. So when humans when the female produces an egg, we have cells that produce those, and we name the cells with OO in front of their name. We'll deal with that later. But these produce non-motile gametes, or an egg. Okay? So the human egg is non-motile. In other words, it doesn't have any means of moving around. Your body, the female's body has to, from where it's produced, has to move it into a location where the sperm can get at it and fertilize it. Something else has to move it. The antheridium, which would be anther is kind of like the male part of a flower. So this is functioning kind of like the pollen producing sacs on a flower. They produce a gamete that is mobile, okay? Which is kind of different than maybe it is in plant, because pollen grains just float around with the wind. But this is a motile gamete, which means it can swim toward the egg to fertilize it. So something, attracts it to it, and so the antheridium is the one that produces these motile gametes. The oogonium produces a gamete that can't move around, and we just call it an egg or an ovum. And they will find each other and form a zygospore again. Okay, so come right back to that same place. So anytime a gamete, whether they're just a plus or minus, or they're the same, identical, like iso, or they're hetero, like this, the final result is to try to form a zygote, or a zygospore. Okay, once it puts the shell around the outside, we call it a zygospore. So here's what we were talking about. So this is the structure that produces the egg, called the oogonium. This is the structure over here that produces the sperm equivalent, a gamete that can swim, and it will swim over to here, and it will fertilize the egg, forming a zygote. That zygote will be converted into a zygospore and leave the parent organism, and then from there it will produce a zoospore that can move someplace else and grow into another algae plant or organism.